with that, Susana, I want to turn it over to you. And yeah, we'll just kind of your talking points for maybe till maybe like 25, 30 after, and then team, please take notes and let's just be prepared to ask Susana any questions after about 7:30. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Clark. And thank you all for having me here. Very honored to speak with you all. I love Mills College. They regularly, as I'm sure you guys all know, host tech intersections. Just one of my favorite tech conferences. It's for women of color in tech, specifically brown and Black women. My name is Susana Benavidez. I grew up in Boyle Heights. It's a predominantly working class Latinx neighborhood here in Los Angeles. I started my career at the city of Los Angeles. I went straight from high school and started working just out of family need. And I worked there for nearly a decade in various departments, which was a wealth of learnings and informations and pain points, and convinced me that was not the route I wanted for myself. I shifted to the private sector, where I was eventually the global business development lead for the technology, transactions, IP, and privacy group for Latham & Watkins, or a global law firm. And while there, I loved the quick learning. I loved that I could sort of push myself and grow myself and really sort of create a position for myself, create opportunities for myself. It taught me a lot of, it surfaced a lot of skills that I maybe didn't know how to name at the time. I realized I was really good at facilitating high stake deals, fixing problems, building teams, programs, and products. I also learned that I hated working in corporate, specifically in a culture that just took much too long for change. And specifically, I also learned that I needed to sort of seek out a career where there was always some positive social impact component. And you're just not going to find that in corporate law. So I quit my job when I was accepted at Stanford. I was an adult student. I was doing my undergrad in my 30s. So I was studying computer science and the AI track. That was quite the experience, I can tell you. And then most recently, I was the chief strategy officer and head of AI at City Innovate, where I met Jeff and Clark. City Innovate's a GovTech startup. It has a couple of arms. And so I focused on the company's automation efforts and all AI efforts in terms of how do you maximize the contribution of agencies when they're looking at procurement, et cetera. And then I also launched a National Science Foundation program, brand spanking new, called STIR Labs. And that's a program that matches local agencies and state agencies to universities. And the motivation for that was, one, NSF really wanted to see, can you find a way in which you test out these localized models where, say, the city of LA can work with a local university, such as like Cal State LA, and really take advantage of that community know-how. That also morphed into, could we find a way to diversify academia? So not just bring forward the usual players that cities tend to get, I wouldn't say just excited about, but also, you have City of LA, instead of maybe looking at Cal State LA, they tend to look at Harvard or Stanford or Berkeley, et cetera, those sort of well-known names. And the motivation there was, can we bring forward some academics that are reflective of the community? And apologies, there's always ambulances. But and then the other part is, could we find a way to really sort of bring forward the voice of the community? Not necessarily having community members at this early juncture, because again, this was a pilot program that we were testing out, but could we somehow ensure that that community voice was coming forward? And I'll talk about that a little later. And all of this being in the service of going after really critical issues that the communities were facing. So at City of Innovate, I had the opportunity to build these products and programs for good. I really enjoyed working there. I enjoy challenges. This was funded with an eager grant, which essentially is a long shot or moonshot type of problem, where they're like, hey, if you can make any headway, great. And that started off in June. And the sort of deadline was this June coming up to test it out and see if that was possible. And I want to talk a little bit about that, because when I joined, we had received the grant. We had a sort of light roadmap, but there was really no vision behind the program. There was no direction in terms of who to bring forward. What does this mean about bringing the community voice? What is a critical community issue, et cetera? And that was both daunting and really exciting. And that's where, design thinking really came into play, because I think, as we can all agree, really hard problems are incredibly overwhelming. If you don't break this big sort of problem, take homelessness, if you don't break it into its underlying smaller parts, most folks tend to either just shy away from the problem, focus on the administrative side. I've seen that in the city where, City of LA has this extensive homeless problem that they've had, for as long as I remember, and it's only going to get worse. And so instead of maybe going directly and trying to break up, well, why don't we map out what does this homeless community look like, right? So differentiate from the working poor, families that are unhoused versus single individual adults or children, et cetera. You can't really start to understand, well, how can I help, right? And so this is where you can really start thinking about, well, what are my sources of information? Where does the tension lie? Who are the most vulnerable? And this is all in really understanding who you aim to serve, what they need and what they fear. And what I mean by that, that's what I saw a lot on the government side. So, back in June, I start thinking about recruiting local agencies throughout the US. And when I'm speaking to the officials, depending on the problem, either the fear is fear of doing the same thing, right? So something you have to understand is that these government agencies, it's not the first time that they hear about some great new NSF program, right? They've heard about this before. They get approached by startups, et cetera, left and right. So it's that fear of, I'm going to invest this time. I'm going to say that I'm putting my resources towards something. The community will find out about it. And if all I come out with is another plan or a paper or some, the policy paper that says, well, here's the problem, but there's no traction towards a solution, that's a real failure, right? On the government agency side. Another type of fear is we had two cities that were working on politically sensitive problems. So we had the city of West Sacramento, who was working on a defunding the police initiative. They had it signed off and approved by city council and the mayor. And what that effort looked like was that they took the money that would have gone to salaries of police officers and they diverted it to go to the salaries of social workers, so that these social workers could ride along and approach a situation where there was some indication that maybe there was a mental health crisis component, right? So de-escalate the problem, appropriately approach the situation so that you can help, right? Instead of hurting or exacerbating the situation. And the other one was Austin, which was a similar focus in that it was also policing, but this was how can they better train their police officers during crowd control, whether it be a concert, right? Or some unplanned gathering or protest, right? And so both of these agencies were incredibly fearful of, like, what if we get paired with some university, some academic team with some nefarious agenda, and they go along, they get our data, and then they make us look really bad. And that's not an easy fear to sort of quell, right? And so that's sort of also where the power of design thinking comes into play. But before I say that, I do want to say that you won't always agree with everyone's perspectives. So this takes a lot of practice. You need to practice intense listening so you can bring folks to the table first. And then you also need to use radical empathy so that you can really take the learnings that you have from the conversation and inject them into your approach. And I say this because as a Latina, as a woman of color, as someone that is a child of immigrants who were undocumented for a large portion of my life, I'm not going to, or I should say, I know that I have a lot of biases inside in terms of how I believe policing should look like or not look like. But it doesn't serve me, it doesn't help me if I lead with those assumptions and those biases, if the goal here is to bring folks to the table, pair them, and then create traction towards a solution that would be for community good. But in terms of going back to the quelling of the fear, this is where it took, I think I did 50 interviews with folks throughout the US, so different city officials across different levels. And I purposefully tried to interview folks that I didn't think were going to be interested in joining or who maybe weren't a good fit, maybe for year two. And I did this because I wanted to take the learnings and the patterns that I would find, sorry, still learning how to use my stand-up desk, and take those learnings so that then I could essentially map out the patterns of what are the concerns, what are the sort of decision-making mechanisms within agencies. And that way, when I was sort of ready to make a pitch for someone that I did want to bring in, I could already have the answers, the information. I could essentially at least really neutralize the situation. Like this is someone I have my government experience, I've spoken to these folks, I'm well informed. And then there's also like the brainstorming, right? So as Jeff and Clark, I'm sure say many, many times, is the use yes and, right? And it's such a simple thing, but it's incredibly powerful. Because even just teaching these the folks at these government agencies, the power of yes and was incredibly helpful because you're naming it, right? So I have one of my personal ethos or mantras is name it to tame it, right? If you don't name it, it's just kind of flying out here, so they're scared and they're afraid. Instead, you can say, I can see that it seems that you were afraid that you're going to invest these resources, these times in the public eye, and it might backfire, and it might make your boss, the mayor, look bad, right? It seems like you're concerned that this academic, it won't be on your side, won't be neutral, etc. And then you sort of come in with the sort of the answers or the responses that you've brainstormed already in terms of how you're going to handle these situations, right? That goes all into the sort of nitty gritty, but just being prepared with naming of their fears, going in with the sort of brainstorming of what you've already set up for them, so you can show them what success can look like. You can walk them through this roadmap. You'll note that most people that you meet that work within government are extremely methodical, right? They want to be taken from step by step by step. And if they need to spend 30 minutes on step A, then you spend 30 minutes, right? You don't want to rush it in the service of what you may believe is progress, because if you do, you're rushing, you're moving forward, sure, but they've already disengaged. They've already sort of taken a step back, and it's going to break apart, right? So it's sort of like building this bridge where you're constantly reinforcing it before you build some more to really make true progress. And again, it's these like many conversations that you have, and these are interviews, right? I had a drive, like a folder drive for each of the agency that I spoke to, each of the questions, each of the insights, and I kept a running doc separate from like my roadmap that essentially were like the learnings of the week, the insights of the week. And that was incredibly helpful because it made me go back and sort of like, okay, here's what I learned. Now let me build on top of that and on top and on top. As opposed to, I'm learning so much as I'm like building the plane that I'm forgetting. I'm like swapping out one knowledge for a new knowledge, right? And this goes into really the prototyping, right? So I had to do a lot of prototyping where when I met with one agency, say when I met with Pittsburgh, whatever I learned there, as soon as I noticed some type of something broke, where they were like, I'm not sure about this, that's a new learning. And so I adapted it. So then when I spoke to Detroit, I made sure that I addressed that. And now Detroit says yes, right? So you really want to think about, like, even when you are working with someone else, maybe even just as a facilitator, you have to be thinking of your prototyping, your conversations and your approaches with them. And they are your feedback loop, right? So like learn and adapt, learn and adapt. It's like this never ending wheel. Thinking about sort of just prototyping itself as well. I worked, a few years ago, I worked for an ed tech company. And what they were doing was that we were mapping out the lectures, so recordings of a lecture. And then my job was to do the back end AI work so that I could filter out the voices of the students from the teacher, and then filter out the voices of students by gender. And the goal was, let's measure and provide this feedback loop for teachers to show what percentage of talk time, right, are they taking? And there's a sweet spot, right? There's like about, I believe it's all 70%. And so you want to make sure that the teacher is speaking enough, that they're obviously lecturing and teaching, but also taking time to listen, and that the students are being included, right, in the conversation. And then the one by gender, it was, well, let's dig a little deeper and see, of those students who are speaking up, who is speaking up, right? And our original thought was, well, let's sell this to the teachers directly. Like, this is a professional development tool for them. They want to improve as teachers, et cetera. So we, build out that prototype. We start interviewing teachers. There's some traction there. They like it. But what became evident very quickly was that, these teachers are incredibly busy. The last thing they need is another tool. The last thing they need is to like learn, and there has to be accountability, but then also there has to be someone that can essentially say, like, pat on the back, right? Like, you're doing well, or let me work with you and improve. And so then we sort of took a step back and thought about that, and we pivoted. And now it was, well, let's present this to the administrators instead. And so then we created a dashboard for the principal and superintendents, et cetera, so that they could get a sense of their school and, how their teachers are performing, how the students are, how engaged, right? So it's all in honor of measuring student engagement. They loved it, but then we quickly realized that they love the sort of, I want to know who is performing this way. I want to know, teacher A, B, C. And so that's an interesting part of prototyping, I think, that I hadn't learned about until that moment, which was, you don't just prototype for your client, right? You also have ethics, and there's also privacy concerns. And so we actually made the decision, as our next iteration was to provide really rich information to these administrators, but it was also so that there was no way that they could reverse engineer and figure out which teacher was performing in which manner, because this was an edtech company. Like, our mission was to improve student engagement, help teachers out, supercharge, right, their ability to teach. It was not to maybe become a tool for administrators to reprimand teachers, right? And so we would have ended up with a completely different product, a teaching policing product, you can say. And so you can see how this like small decision, you could say a small technical decision in prototyping, had a big sort of, well, one big repercussions for who our end users were going to be. And our end users truly, end benefit users were the students. It wasn't the teachers and it wasn't the administrators, right? We wanted to increase student engagement because we want students to have the opportunity to learn more. If this had turned into a policing tool, then it wasn't going to be used and no one was going to benefit from it. So it's good to sort of ask yourself these questions too as you're prototyping, because it's very easy to get caught up in the moment when you're prototyping to only think about, well, what is the client telling me? What do they need? Oh, I can build this. Let me go build this and then deliver it. And then forget to think, well, wait, is this the right approach, right? Another aspect of design thinking that was critical with STIR Labs was the power of reframing. So for example, Baton Rouge in Louisiana was one of our participants. And they started off with this very big general problem, which was food insecurity. How can they solve food insecurity, specifically in the rural areas? And after we went through the exercises with Jeff and Clark, one went from just solve food insecurity, and then just broke it down. Well, what exactly, what aspect, what's going on here, right? What are the assumptions and who are the stakeholders and who are the users? And then that sort of empathy mapping of, well, the users could be Brenda, who is a 50-year-old grandmother, right? Living with her grandson. And she can't go and access the food, even if it's offered, because she's taking care of her grandson, right? So, and it then moved from just food insecurity, which was very daunting, to, well, we noticed that there's 30 players on the server side, so including government, nonprofits, etc., that wanted to help, but they weren't speaking to each other. Things were breaking down. So then it was okay, one problem that we can go after is, well, why don't we look at the logistics, right, of distributing food to the users in this area? And then the reframing part came in when folks were saying, well, we were so successful, we served 1,000 meals in the last month, for example. But then, the community itself is saying, okay, you served 1,000 meals in the last month, but you gave me 3 meals a day for 7 days, and I don't have the refrigeration to handle that food and store that food. So by day 3, I'm out of food because it's all spoiled. And so then it's, okay, maybe it's not measuring success, the number of meals that are distributed, maybe it's number of meals that are consumed, right? And by asking that question, then you're going and approaching the interviews of the stakeholders, the end users themselves, and saying, how do you get your food? How do you receive your food? Do you have to walk? How long do you have to walk? Are they giving you the kind of food that you normally eat? Is it part of your normal diet? Another issue that came up was that because the food distribution centers tend to be in urban centers, right, cities, they would get first dibs. And so by the time that the food was distributed in the rural area, it was sort of the leftovers. It was the food that folks in that area did not eat. So if you don't know how to cook something, how are you going to eat it, right? I personally, I had never heard about raspberries or blueberries or blackberries until I was 22, So if you'd given that to me as a kid at school, I'd probably be like, what is this? So it's that sort of constant reframing, which is what you're saying this, and let's all discuss it and think about, well, what are, again, underlying issues contributing to it, right? And you can keep doing this, it's a step thing. And then how can we maybe reframe this to get to the root of the problem? And then another part of that is also, and something that I encouraged all of the agencies to do. So we had about 17 cities and counties and state agencies throughout the US, which was map out where you are and map out where you've been. And this was incredibly important. For example, in the city of Santa Fe, they started off thinking, hey, I want to become the next Silicon Valley. We have the national labs in our backyard. We have, great university, we have the talent, like, why aren't we Silicon Valley? And very quickly, very quickly, as soon as they published that problem, they got feedback from the community itself. And the community was like, excuse me, no, I don't want this to be Silicon Valley. How is being Silicon Valley going to help me, this is an actual example, a 30-something employee at Home Depot? What job am I going to take when this becomes Silicon Valley? All that it is going to create from their perspective is that they're going to be priced out and have to live further from their place of employment, drive up their costs, right? In terms of trying to get to work, and etc. So it took them a step back to really think, you know what, before we think about, oh, be the next Silicon Valley, that's the solution. Let's maybe look at what does that even bring up for the community if you say, I'm going to be the next Silicon Valley? And why does it bring that up? And so when they start interviewing the sort of tech folks that are already there, they're saying, well, folks aren't entrepreneurial enough, they're not interested enough, et cetera. That was their explanation for the lag of Latinx and Black residents sort of being a part of the future of innovation. And then when they start, interviewing different aspects of the community, including the academic team that they were matched to, then they start learning, well, let's think back, right? Like, what is Santa Fe known for? Santa Fe is known for its culture and its art, and its indigenous vibrancy, right? But what is the trauma that is within that community? And that trauma is, well, colonized, right, by the Spanish, their land and a lot of major aspects of their culture taken away. And if you think about that part, right, that is a very old and strong memory and pain point in that community. Saying that you're going to become Silicon Valley, it's almost like you want to recolonize them, but now with the VCs and entrepreneurs of the Bay Area. And so they then changed and created a new challenge that was, well, how can we create this inclusive economy that everyone can participate so that we can elevate all of our community members together? So as you can see, it's almost a little scary to think how easy this sounds, right? Like, why isn't everyone using design thinking? And one aspect that we learned was that the power of this third party, this sort of neutral third party. I brought aboard several sort of like folks that played that role. I myself was like a neutral third party, right? I'm doing the matchmaking. I'm helping them go through this process. I want to see you succeed. And when I talk to you and when you see me, I'm going to lean in and I'm going to be an empathetic listener. I'm on your side. When I need the really hard discussions, when I see some tension, then I bring in Jeff and Clark. And they're a neutral, third party. And they can say things that maybe I can't say, right? And so it's design thinking, it's powerful because, one, folks sometimes when we think about these really big problems, these wicked problems, we tend to just get daunted and kind of turn off and want to lean out. And we think there's no way, because if there was a way, it would have been done already. And so instead, when you sort of come in almost with this like simplistic approach of, well, let's map it out, let's brainstorm, let's break it up. It's like having to clean, your entire house. You're like, oh God, I don't want to do that, right? But all of a sudden, maybe your siblings or a friend comes over and they start helping you out. All of a sudden, you're kind of having a good time. You're like talking and listening to music, and it's a social thing. So I think that that's something that we tend to forget, which is that design thinking is a social exercise, and we're social human beings. That is how we thrive. So I'll stop there because I know I am at a little bit beyond the 30 mark, and happy to go further or answer any questions that anyone has.
What do you think, Clark?
I think I've learned a whole bunch from you already, Susana.
He tells the
And
story better than we tell it.
I tell you, it's amazing. And something else I wanted to ask you, since I've started to talk, is, and I actually you've illuminated this for me tonight, but I'm always astounded at the amount of work you do on behalf of these clients, on behalf of the program. I mean, you're kind of a superhero energy person. Where does this come from? I mean, is this a professional discipline you have? Is this a survival instinct? Where does this come from? Because I think I'm asking you this, Susana, because it's inspiring to hear what you do. And even I, the old dog at this, think, man, where do you get all the time? Where's the energy? How do you organize this stuff? So I just wanted to ask that question.
Yeah, thank you. I think that it comes from my upbringing. Again, we grew up really poor, super poor. The kind of poor where you face real food insecurity and you don't know where you're going to live. And my parents were always afraid that they were going to be deported. And so it essentially makes you an invisible person, right? Growing up. One, you're not seen by agencies who hold the resources that you need access to. And two, you make yourself invisible because you don't want to bring attention to yourself lest they find out that your parents are undocumented and they take them away. And that type of instability and fear, don't recommend it, but it does teaches you empathy. It taught me to view my parents as my children. I think a lot of children of immigrants can relate, which is that you are the translator, the family lawyer, the family doctor, you're everything, right? And I think that being able to look at human suffering, struggle, tension, whatever you want to call it, sometimes it's really overwhelming. Sometimes you can feel like it takes all of you. But then sometimes you can also look at it like, I get to help. I get to do something here. I get to give myself an honor of something good. And I've really taken that and implemented into all aspects of my life. Something I also like to draw on is that, what's the hardest thing that I've lived so far? And I grew up with a lot of my friends who were, former gang members. I think I lost 90% of my friend group by the time I was middle school to drive-by shootings, whether they were the targets or innocent bystanders or juvenile hall, and then ultimately prison. And again, it's like that type of loss, you experience it at a young age. You don't really know that that's not normal, right? You don't know that living in a war zone in East LA or South LA is not normal. And once you realize that it's not normal, it can be sort of excuse my language, it can be a mind fuck, because you're like, wait, I've been existing in this world and this is not normal. And this isn't recognized. This trauma isn't recognized. I'm not giving any extra resources when I had to face regular drive-by several times a day and duck and fear random shootings and fear the police and fear immigration. And so I take all of that. And when I hear these agencies trying to address really critical issues that the communities face, I know that fear, I know that concern, not just from them, but of their community. So the way I see it is that I'm here on the community side. And maybe I'm not able to convince them to bring them from the get-go, but I can at least operate, as that sort of that cheerleader, that constant re-asking of how are we ensuring that the community's voice comes through? How are we ensuring that we are planning for what they want and need and not what we assume is needed. And how are we ensuring that the right voices are in the room, right? And that's real power. That's power that you hold with you wherever you go. Being a student at Stanford, I held immense power because that's a powerful institution. Just being a student there, I did not feel powerful while there, but I had power. I had the power to bring other folks, younger folks, and make them feel like they belonged. And so I think that that's what I mean by radical empathy, right? Sometimes it's also a good coping mechanism when you are dealing with your own sort of issues, as we all are these days, is to sort of look at their problem, their issue, and really pour all your empathy into it. And then from there, think, well, what can I do, right? How can I help? What can I do on the background? Because I think that's the another thing you're getting at, Clark, which is this took a lot of back channeling, so that by the time that I showed up and sort of folks were all together, all of that had been cleared up. And if questions or fears or concerns came up, it's like bam, 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 right? You've addressed it. You've had those discussions. They feel like you're on their side as well. And again, this is true for working with startups, working with government agencies, and working with academia.
Thank you for that wonderful explanation.
I have a question for you. This is Joanna. I'm wondering how your voice and your opinion throughout the years as a leader has been received in the circles that you've worked with, especially coming from your background as a woman, and how you've dealt with the challenges or other within that.
Thank you. I love that question, Joanna. You know, your voice is not always going to be welcomed, right? Your voice many times is going to actually come off as like abrasive or annoying or hard to actually talk, right? I've experienced that, definitely, for sure. But because I experienced that, I learned sort of like how to handle the situation. I think number one, ego has no place, you know, in any conversation. And many times what we think in terms of how we feel we should be heard, it's actually our ego, right? It's, hey, I have this title. Like, why didn't they invite me to this call? Why didn't they include me on this initiative, etc.? Now, that's also exclusion, right? I don't want to minimize that, but it's also ego. Like, I should have been asked. And instead, maybe you can include your voice, bring your voice to the table, again, by doing a lot of that back channeling. That's just sort of like, whether it's office politics, whatever it is, that's universal, right? When I was at Latham & Watkins, which is that corporate law firm, I was the only woman of color in my entire department. I was the only woman of color in the entire Northern California offices. There's not a single lawyer that was a person of color. And so when I would walk into spaces, I'm supposed to walk in as someone that is teaching them, that they have to follow, right? And how I handle that situation is that leadership has many faces. Sometimes that was me going one-on-one, certain individuals, and having the conversations. And sometimes I'm not gonna lie, it was me having a conversation with a certain personality that has a big ego, and me just being like deferential, like, oh yes, right? And you get really good at making people think that's their idea. And sometimes you walk into a room and you command it and you say it, right? And so it's that, I think it all goes again into that empathy, because empathy doesn't mean only for someone that is struggling. Empathy is, how can I position myself in their shoes from their perspective, even if it's an ugly perspective, so that I can better understand who I'm speaking to and how to approach them. Another aspect of that, though, is that, you know, with age and experience, and credentialing or whatever, right? There's many aspects of this. Your voice does hold more power. And sometimes it's hard to adapt to like that new power. Like it took me a little bit. At first, I got stuck on like, no, wait, I'm that single mom who's like has no power and is just trying to make ends meet and feed my kids. And I had to do a sort of radical reinterpretation of my life to be like, that's not where you're at anymore. You know, you are now in this space of power. And so recently I was invited to be a part of this national research think tank. Super honored, right? Super excited. It was thinking about the planning of who should get federal grants for community, sort of just community projects, whatever it may be. And so very quickly, I'm honored, I'm excited. I'm like, oh my gosh, like this is awesome, right? Little Susie in me is always like, whoa, you're there. And then I look around, right? Not necessarily the room, but the gallery. And I notice that I'm the only Latina. There's no Latinos. There are no disabled folks. There are no Black people. There was one Asian member person, and they them were the moderator, right? So I'm thinking, okay, like this is exciting and this is great, but isn't this exactly what I've always learned, which is that the folks that make the decisions tend to be this homogeneous group and they don't include us. And maybe they do include us, it's just kind of like happenstance, or, you know, I started asking myself, like, am I here to fill a quota? Am I here to really be heard? And when I would speak up, I kept getting not just mansplained, but also white-splained, right? Like, oh no, let me tell you the situation. It's like, no, actually, I'm very informed with that situation, and I have all of this wealth of experience that I'm bringing. I'm posing this question because there's no one else here to pose that question, and it's very uncomfortable. But by the third call, when I saw that they hadn't onboarded anyone else, I was like, hey, you know, I feel really uncomfortable being a part of this space that has so much power, so much decision-making power for the next 20 years of how the National Science Foundation is going to give out grants throughout the US. Where are the voices of the community? You know, and no one spoke up. Talk a little bit, I bring it up again, right? And now I'm like shaking and I'm trying to hide my hands that are clearly shaking. And I bring it up again. This is a serious problem. This is not a nice to have, right? And again, it's like, okay, yes, we'll put it on the minutes on the table for the next one. No, third time I was like, look, I'm removing myself from this situation. I do not feel comfortable being the only person of color and there not being anyone else reflective of the community. And it's such a big problem that we need to pause this until this is fixed. And then I followed it up with an email. And essentially I had to shame them a little bit, right? Or at least raise the flags. Now, I wouldn't have been able to do that 10 years ago, but I can do that now. And they did take a pause, and they did. And then I got one-on-one emails and feedback. And so folks then created the system to bring more voices, and voices plural, right? Not just single per category as a checkbox. And so I think that how your power and leadership is taken, it's taken many ways. It's taken and it's not taken. And you kind of have to just roll off the not taken and think about, well, how else can I get this voice, this perspective in here? Maybe it's not through you. Maybe you are not being receptive to what I'm saying, but maybe I can find these other folks that are part of the cohort. They are receptive. And now I bring it up again in a group setting, and now we're all receptive. So now you grow more receptive and sort of join the fold, you know? And so it all goes back to that sort of like empathy. How can I bring you along with me? How can we together sort of move forward, as opposed to, I disagree with you, I vehemently disagree with you, and I'm going to tell you, and then I've lost all opportunity to make any change. Sorry, that was a lot.
You're speaking from the heart, and this is great. keep going.
I do want to say, Jeff just told me that Mills College is going through, well, you guys are all going through a crisis, right? Learning about degrees not being conferred after 2023. And I did want to note that, you know, along with radical empathy, I'm a big believer in there's power in vulnerability, you know, and there's nothing makes us more vulnerable than when we fear failure, right? When we think failure is imminent and there's no way around this. So I just want to say that, you know, I have been homeless as a child and as an adult, as a single mom. I have had many crises that have knocked me on my ass and dug a hole, you know? And the thing that carried me forward was always thinking, you know, there's a saying in Spanish, un día a la vez, or one step at a time, right? You just want to make sure that it can seem like the sky is falling. It can seem like there's no sort of light at the end of the tunnel. But if you're here and you are a little bit forward from where you were yesterday, or even if you're here and you're at the same place, you didn't go back, that is success. And so I think that it's key for us as budding leaders and as we grow in our power to remember that it's not just, there's of course the fear of failure, but I believe in normalizing failure, which means the context of it. You know, what is going on right now that makes me feel like I'm failing? Well, I could say I was a failure when I was a mom of 2 toddlers and we were homeless. I could have said I was a failing mom. But at the same time, you know, I was working 3 jobs and trying to figure a way out of it. And eventually I did. And I didn't have any support system from family. So it wasn't that I was failing as a mom. It was that I was doing the best I could with the conditions I had. And beyond that, it's also celebrating your wins. And this goes in your personal life, and it goes as you work with whatever agencies or communities you choose to work with, is that every win, it merits you celebrating it. If you don't celebrate those wins, you can quickly feel like there's an anchor tied to your foot and you're dragged down into the water because it gets to be too much. And so by celebrating those successes, however small, that's key, you know? And so I just wanted to say that to you all because I can empathize with how scary that can be. Feels like the rug being pulled underneath you. You know, we pull out the rug, the floor is still there, right?
I had a question. My name's Maritza. I'm also from East LA, or I'm from LA. And I know Aniela is also from East LA. But I had a question regarding who I noticed, like, yeah, empathy is such a big thing around you. And how do you make sure that you surround yourself with people that share, I guess, the same definition of empathy, or like just empathy as a whole and on its context, in your, like, in the workplace, I guess, like, most importantly because of how and where you work at, with who you work with, who you are, the lives that you're impacting and everything.
Yeah, that's a really powerful question. Thank you for asking that. I'm going to be honest, you know, most times or many times you won't be able to find that empathy, you know, in the workplace. But I'm also a big believer that we shouldn't define our identity solely on the work that we do, right? That's something that's so prevalent in the United States. Like, it's like what we do for a living is who we are, but that's not true. right? And so when I was working at this other edtech company, so separate edtech company, I was really excited because it was the first tech company where there was a Black engineer and there were female engineers. And so I was like, oh my gosh, like I sort of, honestly, that was my bad. And I learned, I didn't do as much of a due diligence before joining because I was so caught up, I was so excited. And then when I joined, I realized that, well, just because there's a Black engineer or a female engineer does not mean we have anything in common, right? And it doesn't mean that we share values. And so something I have learned is, and Audre Lorde speaks about this a lot, is there's some pitfalls in trying to find our sense of belonging or identity within our identity, if that makes sense. So me getting excited because you're a Latinx engineer, maybe that's going to be a pitfall because I am going to come in with so many assumptions that we have so much in common. I definitely ran into that at Stanford as well. I would go into a classroom and I'd be like, oh my gosh, there's another Latina student in CS. But that Latina student was the granddaughter of a former president of Argentina, right? I'm the daughter of 2 cooks, right? That were laborers for their entire life and don't speak English. So I just want to say that because that's caused me so much pain. And so hopefully that will help. But the way that I deal with that is that when I was working at the edtech company, it was really hard. I mean, I was deeply depressed because I thought, you know, here I am in this edtech company that is doing good. It was, we were creating a product that was like a no-code platform specifically to sort of lower the barrier to tech. Sounds great, but working there was not great. And so what I did was seek out sort of similar-minded, empathetic thinkers within my community elsewhere. I found that through Techeria, which is like Latinx and tech. I found it through Colibri, which is this book club for like Latinas. I found it with my children and my partner, right? And so many times you will not find that at work. But I will say that on the flip side, you know, I'm currently now working on building my own company. That was always the end goal. That was the big dream. I wanted to be an entrepreneur. I wanted to be a founder. I wanted to create a culture and a company and hire the way that I would like to be hired and hire those that look like me or have experiences like me. And so now I get to build that and I get to ensure that that empathy is core to the culture. You know, and so as many of us who are going to be new to being in places of power because our parents weren't, I want to remind you that it's not the goal line, right? The goal line is not to be accepted. I don't want to be accepted because to me, being accepted sounds like being tolerated. And I don't want to be tolerated. I want to be seen and I want to be heard. And I want those like me to be seen and heard. And so my approach here is to build my own company.
Well, you've certainly been seen and heard this evening, and we're so grateful that you shared your experience and your journey with us. Incredibly valuable. I don't want to cut it short. We have to make sure everybody gets their breaks and switch over. Susana, is it okay to share your email with the students so they may reach out with any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I will put it in the chat, or if you could put it, actually,
Yeah, I'll drop it in. Don't worry about it.
Yeah,
you're the guest of honor. We're here to facilitate your work. So, yeah.
No, I'm always happy to connect, you know, after with anyone who's interested in. I also, if you guys ever want to join me on similar panels, I do a lot of talks for students, high school students, middle school students. I have a wealth of opportunities for you to volunteer alongside with me.